Starting a minute early. Hello and welcome. I'm Kimberly from the Country Bookshop, and in An Emancipation of the Mind, Radical Philosophy, the War Over Slavery and the Refounding of America, Matthew Stewart highlights a moment when a book is found in a bookshop that changed the course of history. And while this event was 95 years before the Country Bookshop was founded in 1953 by two very interesting women, we continue our existence today because our community of locals and visitors continues to buy books from us. It is an honor, and we hope that you consider us your bookshop. And if you are new to us, we hope that you can visit us online or stop in downtown Southern Pines, North Carolina, where we can chat with you about books in the store, highlighting books like Matthew Stewart's that we will be speaking about today, introducing you to other authors, either on the shelf or in person at an event, or if you like, supporting the work that we tirelessly do to get books in the hands of students across our state. We thank you. I want to note that in 2010, our local newspaper, The Pilot, purchased the bookstore. And I want to thank you, Matthew, for joining us, but also for mentioning the transformative power of a bookshop in getting books into people's hands. But I do believe that the kind of great book find that can happen in a bookshop is far from a passive lucky find. A good bookshop makes that kind of luck possible. And any bookshop is only possible because of the community. The people who choose every day or week or month or just at the holidays when you want to get something for your neighbor or before vacation, that you choose to buy a book from us. So welcome, Matthew. I will introduce you now that I've said something about the bookshop. Matthew is an independent philosopher and historian who has written extensively about the philosophical origins of the American Republic, the history of philosophy, management theory, and the culture of inequality in wildly successful books. His work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, among other publications. And in recent years, he has lived in Boston, New York, and Los Angeles, and is currently based in London. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. It's so nice to be here with you. And I love the bookstore anecdote. Should I tell that story?
Sure.
So, um, my book got started in a way when I came across a piece of this anecdote, and it involves two people. One of them I think most people will have heard of, and that's Frederick Douglass, right? So the famous abolitionist, born enslaved in Maryland, escaped when he was 20 years old. And then the other one is this woman, Ottilie Assing, who was a German immigrant, an intellectual, wildly liberated, hyper-educated. And she moved to the US after the revolutions of 1848 in Germany and in Europe. She was sort of a refugee, but also running away from complicated domestic personal situations. When she came over, she came across Frederick Douglass's autobiography. So that's the first find in a bookstore. She goes to a bookstore, but this is not the main story. She finds that book, his second autobiography, and she falls in love first with the book and then with the man that she thinks wrote the book. And she says, I have to translate this into German. I love this book. And it's Frederick Douglass's really passionate, moving story about his own escape from slavery. It's called My Bondage and My Freedom. So she's going to translate it, but she says, I've got to meet this man. So she goes and finds him in his house in upstate New York. And you have to read the description of her entry into this house. I mean, she describes it as high up on a hill and, overlooking majestically everything around it. And then she comes up to the door, knocks on the door, and this absolutely gorgeous black man steps out, and you can just see that Ottilie is in love. Now, there's some debate about how intense their relationship got. The evidence suggests that they had an affair that lasted 28 years. But these things are never all that easy to prove. Although Frederick Douglass apparently burned the evidence of it after she died. So that's a pretty inculpating situation. So she meets him. They start a relationship, and then she takes on this role of educating him because she feels that she's bringing all this European culture, and he's a great abolitionist, but he's just not properly schooled in philosophy. And she's looking around for stuff to teach him. She finds Goethe, the famous German poet. That's kind of obvious. And then she goes into a New York bookshop, and she comes across this book by Ludwig Feuerbach. So she would have known who Feuerbach was at the time, but she hadn't read his book. But more importantly, she found the translation. It was a translation by Marianne Evans, who we now know as George Eliot, the famous English writer, Middlemarch and so on. So anyway, she gets the book, and then she curls up with Frederick for an entire summer, and they read it extremely closely. And that's how I got started on this project, because you see, I'd made the mistake of studying 19th century German philosophy back in the day, graduate school. We all make these mistakes, right? So as I was reading some of Douglas's works, it became clear to me that he had read Feuerbach. I mean, he was just saying things that you would only say in that context if you had read Feuerbach, certain turns of phrase and certain metaphors. I bring that up in the introduction to the book. And so it was according to Ottilie, this absolutely transformed Frederick's outlook, absolutely changed the way he viewed the world. It didn't bring him to abolitionism. He already was that, but it changed the way he thought about what he was doing in a really important way. Changed his kind of religious perspective. I mean, he was, let's say before that, he was essentially a skeptical, sort of light humanist, and Feuerbach, who was a pretty hardcore humanist, kind of flipped him towards a more explicit secularism and humanism. So I came across this. I found it. I just hadn't really appreciated the extent to which German philosophy and radical German philosophy had made its way into America's anti-slavery movement, and that made me rethink what was actually going on in the struggle over slavery. And so that led to my book. So you could argue that, like, her book find led to the creation of my book. So that's the story anyway.
Well, it's interesting you talk about her coming to the first book, wanting to translate it, and just that movement of ideas, because your book that moves a lot of ideas through in a really easily digestible way, which is amazing considering the complexity of some of the stuff in there. When I look at, and I didn't list all of your books in the bio, but I'm curious. You mentioned that you started your study of philosophy, but then when I look at your books that you published over time, there's a through line of ideas, and I'm wondering if you could talk about your study a little bit further, beginning with your earlier books, and to that, do you consider the 9.9% to be kind of a companion book to the An Emancipation of the Mind, or do you see one as an academic argument and one as like a current mirror? How do you?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking me about me. I guess that's why we're here, to clarify that. And let me answer first very simply. Yes, the books are connected. They're very much part of the same project, the same story. Those two books, and in fact, I would say all 7 of my books, are really part of a single story. Now, I think many people who just look at the titles or see where they're filed away in the bookstores probably wouldn't get that, because one of them is about the history of management thought. The 9.9% is notionally about economic inequality in the United States. but in fact, there is a connection through all of them, and they do all go back to my basic interest in philosophy and the history of philosophy, and that is what I studied initially, and they're all kind of an exploration of that. So, what more substantively, here's the simple connection. I'll start with the last two books. In the 9.9%, even though I want to make use of a lot of social and cultural analysis, I want to bring in, facts about America in the 21st century. I want to make a more general point about the connection between inequality or injustice in more general terms and rationality. So the core argument of the book is actually not an argument about the American class structure. I'm using that as a way of illustrating the real core argument, which is that inequality creates unreason. And I show how it does that in the American context. But here's the inside story. I actually started writing that book after I had mostly finished, or at least let's say I got through a rough draft of An Emancipation of the Mind. Because An Emancipation of the Mind has the same core argument. The core argument is that the slave system generated a tremendous degree of inequality. It was a profoundly unjust system, and that injustice, it doesn't just sit there. It infects and kind of corrupts and poisons our thinking. It made people deeply irrational in that 19th century context, and that manifested itself in their rejection of the Enlightenment, in their falling for all kinds of crazy forms of religion, and so that I saw that in the 19th century context, and I interrupted the Emancipation of the Mind because I thought, well, history books are important, but they're kind of timeless. I mean, it doesn't really affect the world that much when they come out. Whereas something that's more focused on the contemporary world and the emerging bigger divisions in U.S. society now and the political instability that's brought, that's more of the moment. And so I kind of shifted gears. I wrote the 9.9%, and then after finishing that, I went back to An Emancipation of the Mind. So they're connected. And then I don't want to bore you and your listeners with the whole preceding history, but essentially all of my previous books in some way or other are drawing on a similar set of themes. Just to wrap it up in a sort of grandiose way, I think that philosophy is, I don't believe it's an academic discipline. I don't think it's the right way to think about it is that it's just what a collection of people in a certain academic department do. Bless them, let them do that stuff, but it's not, and that's important within its own space, but it's not what it is. What it really is trying to make the world more reasonable, and I think that it's committed to the idea that making the world more reasonable is also making it more just, and making it more just is making it more reasonable. So, and I think the way you do that is by looking at what's actually happening, looking at actual history, looking at, for example, management thought, or, the American Revolution, things like that, and then trying to explain that within this philosophical frame. So that's my agenda. So thanks for asking about that.
So as you're explaining that, you're talking about the movement of ideas and then the action of the ideas.
Yeah, well, it's really complicated how we think about ideas and action, and
You make it uncomplicated in the book, so it's unfair of me to ask you to explain it. But let me actually, I'll go to my next question. Do you believe that ideas always have to start in the fringe and then kind of move into the leaders and shapers of the community who can actually put them into play? Because that's what I understood from reading Nature's God and The Emancipation of the Mind. But do you think that's like the rule?
Well, it's um, yeah, maybe I should come up with a law that says that, but I think it is the way things happen because the, the ruling ideas in society, as has been said many times, um, uh, are generally the ideas of the ruling class, or they're you know they're the ones that are favored by the people in power, and of course they will tend to be uh, you know conservative with a small c. They'll tend to want to consolidate existing power and privilege and stuff like that. So um, uh, to that extent, if you want to change the system, if you want to make it more reasonable, then yes, you'll be seeing these ideas coming in from the fringe. Now, I think it's also important to understand that that you mentioned too the books Nature's God and Emancipation of the Mind. Those are both about specific historical episodes, eras, and in those cases, I do think that the ideas came in from the fringe because we're talking about revolutions. We're talking about a uh, people who were didn't have power or whose power was not expressed through the political system, getting that power realized. And of course, they were coming in from the fringe. So from in Nature's God, I put a lot of emphasis on uh, people who looked fringy, like Thomas Young or Ethan Allen or early on Thomas Paine, who got their ideas into the center and who were able to move things forward. And Emancipation of the Mind tells basically the same story. It's Frederick Douglass, who's a fugitive slave, and he comes in from what has to be the pretty extreme fringe of American society at the time, and has an impact.
Can you talk a little bit about the chain? You can almost see it darting around the world, these ideas. I mean, not almost see it, you very clearly explain it, but specifically about the change when you're talking about the revolution, and then you highlight the counter revolution, but the change in what Thomas Paine specifically meant in the 1840s, and who was reading Thomas Paine's work one generation after the American Revolution.
Yeah, that's really important because I think so. So the bigger issue is how do we think about America's origins and when we were actually created and what really matters, like when which point in time do we pick as being sort of our defining moment. And Americans have generally preferred 1776, and they've said, yeah, that's when we became independent and we established this thing with all men are created equal and so on. But the history of the 19th century doesn't really validate that. And the case of Thomas Paine that you bring up makes that quite clear. So Thomas Paine was absolutely central to the American Revolution. He got things going with common sense. He played a key role in the Pennsylvania Revolution of 1776, helped write the Pennsylvania Constitution with my friend Thomas Young. And he stood for a very radical democratic idea of what was going on. He was also very much a representative of the Age of Reason, which was what the Enlightenment was called at the time. And he was, quite popular, as were some of his fellow travelers around the time of the Revolution. However, his star dimmed, and pretty soon he was regarded as anathema within the United States. And it mainly had to do with his religious positions, but that objection to his religion was also connected to a reaction against democracy. So many of the new people who were gaining power, the Federalists in the Northeast, they were quite hostile to democracy. They had a lot of property to defend. They had mortgage deeds on backcountry farmers. They were not very keen on having these societies of ordinary people getting together and raising a toast to Thomas Paine and talking about how they were going to run the world. That was not actually what they really wanted. So Thomas Paine got very much suppressed in the United States. There's a nice line from I think it was Mark Twain that I quoted, where he says, it would have taken a very brave man before the Civil War to admit that he read Thomas Paine.
That
Now, while
struck me.
that's happening,
Too, yeah.
yeah. And it's really quite striking when you consider the very important role that Paine had in the American Revolution. I mean, it's really a question of betraying one of the founders. We now have this menu of founders, and half of them are slaveholders, and we've dropped out. One of the guys who happened to have been a member of the first abolitionist society. But then what was happening in Germany? See, that's what makes for such an interesting contrast, because at the very same time that Americans are forgetting Paine and the version of the revolution he represents, the Germans over in Germany are bringing out his works. They're translating them, so there's a collected, volume of Gesammelte Werke of Thomas Paine or something like that. It comes out in the 1840s in Germany. They're super excited by him, and then when they immigrate to the United States, they're often bringing Paine with them, and so you have these societies emerging in the American Midwest, in Ohio in particular, where a lot of these Germans settled, that start having these celebrations and these toasts and these roasts in honor of Thomas Paine. But of course, they're mostly organized by Germans, right? So they're kind of bringing back this lost revolutionary spirit, and I think that is part of this arc of counter-revolution and new revolution. That's the story that I'd like to tell about the what we call the Civil War.
I think it's beautifully told, and I think it's you say, as you carry this revolution, counter-revolution, and these ideas to Germany, you talk about, I'm going to quote you to you, blah, 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 the theory of freedom passed along by his German friends, shaping not just his understanding, but of slavery, but the tactics he would embrace in the effort to overcome it. And you talk about how Frederick Douglass understands racism and work and humanity and societal structures, and you really make the argument that we cannot understand the Civil War without understanding Douglass's thinking. And I love watching that bounce back and forth. And as we talk about all your books kind of as a grouping of thinking, I'm curious why you chose to structure the emancipation of the mind in the way that you did. There's a huge chunk in there that's like an incredible, which we need, history of philosophy from Spinoza or whatever on, and a brief history of God. But I'm curious, as you were structuring this whole argument, how was it organized first? Why did you put that chunk in the middle, and how is your splicing and dicing thinking going?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to suggest that it was all perfectly thought out. By the way, I mean, some of it may have been, just what came down. But to the extent that there's a bigger philosophical point, it's that around which it's organized. It's that philosophy, and it goes back to your question about ideas and action, which is very difficult to answer succinctly, but it's that philosophy doesn't really work by getting people to subscribe to some doctrine and then go out and apply that doctrine. That's not a very effective model. The way it works best is when it just clears away misunderstandings. It clears away constructions or assumptions that people had, and then allows them to see better what was going on, right? And I think that Lincoln, in a way, refers to this when he talks about a disenthrallment of the mind. So he says in his speech to Congress just before the Emancipation Proclamation, the ways of thinking of old, we need to leave those behind. We need to, learn to think anew. He literally says that we need to think anew. We need to disenthrall ourselves. And he's specifically referring to the race question. He's basically saying, we've been thinking about slavery as some sort of natural relation, as something that emerges in the contact of two races, and that's just wrong. That isn't actually what is happening here, and we need to see that. And once we see that, we will understand that the way to free all of us is to free the enslaved, and freeing the enslaved brings freedom to everybody. So it's not that he's embraced a doctrine that freedom is good. I mean, everybody thinks that freedom is good. He thought freedom was good beforehand. It's that the philosophy has helped him clear away that misunderstanding. Now, how did that get to the structure of the book? Well, look, to tell a story of disenthrallment, you have characters. So they're people, and history at the end, you have to have people. And I have three main ones: Frederick Douglass, Theodore Parker, and Abraham Lincoln. But then there's very important supporting characters like Audley Assing, who we talked about, and John Brown, and William Herndon, who's Lincoln's sidekick and biographer. I wanted to get those people in there so that we could sort of see their personal transformations. Then I also wanted to get in the fact that their stories are interconnected, and they're interconnected in a way that actually moved the history concretely forward. So the Civil War happened for a number of reasons, but John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was one of those reasons. So it was one of the things, one of the triggers that led to the war, and it led to kind of a crystallization of the underlying conflict. And it turns out that these characters, Theodore Parker, Frederick Douglass, Audley Assing, William Herndon, were in some way or other involved in this John Brown plot. And Abraham Lincoln, during the war, as Frederick Douglass pointed out, ended up kind of implementing John Brown's vision. So he kind of did what John Brown had sort of wanted to happen. So I wanted to get out that story. And then I also wanted to get I guess the three other huge pieces. I wanted to get enough of the history of philosophy in there so that you could see how important this Enlightenment tradition was. I needed to get in a lot of the history of the religion so that you could see the extent to which the American church hierarchy and the theologians, the extent to which they were complicit in the slave system. I had to get that in there. And then I also needed to do a bit of economic analysis. So it's a lot of pieces, and I find that that the best way to do it is the weave, to stitch together. That is, I could have simply done, part one, the characters, part two, the philosophy, but that tends to push readers.
Yeah,
So I go for the weave.
It's beautiful. You said so much of what you're doing is looking at how people translate these ideas. And you said something that was so clear to me that I can't believe it wasn't obvious to me, but all understood. And you're talking about like the German philosophers when they were idea shaping at the time, but all understood the timeless truth that debates about the nature of the Lord in heaven are at bottom debates about who is entitled to rule the earth. And I'm just wondering, you've spent your life in and out thinking about this. Like, when was that obvious to you from the beginning of your philosophy study, or did that just, is that something you understood, that when you're debating about religion, you're debating about who's in charge of on
Yeah,
earth, of society? Is
look,
that something you
I think
got?
I have, yeah. No,
It,
I don't think I emerged, fully formed, as from high school or from graduate school with those ideas fully in place. So I think I have evolved and I have become, I would say, partly through writing these books, um, a little more, a little less idealistic, I guess. A little more convinced that yeah, philosophy and religion tend to be expressions of power,
Mhm.
um, and I've moved, I would say, more in that direction. But I do think that the seed was there, and the reason why it was there is that um, I think you can see this throughout the history of philosophy. And I've always been interested in the whole history of philosophy, and I've never understood why people who call themselves philosophers and go into academic departments, why they how they can be content just analyzing the last papers written in the last 3 years on the freedom of the will or something like that. When in fact there's 3 or 4 millennia of stuff to work with, and most of the arguments are recycled, by the way, and they've all been said before. Um, but I think if you take this broad view of the history of philosophy, you see this same thing happening. So here I'll just do a little detour into the ancient Greek world. I hope you don't mind.
No, no,
It's
because this is good. These were my questions later, so hopefully you'll hit on one of my questions. Keep going.
okay. Well, I'm talking about the role of philosophy and power and liberation and in control. And I think that we often tell the story of the pre-Socratic philosophers, for example, in ancient Greece, as one of individuals emerging from a cave or a mountaintop and looking up at the sky and saying, "Oh my goodness, what are we doing here? What is why is there anything?" and so on, and as if it's all just a set of personal questions, right? And I think if you understand in context, you realize that that isn't an accurate representation of what was going on at all. They were living in a world where they had been told many times in many ways why things were created the way they were. They had lots of origin stories. Most of them took the form of one religion or another. And most of those religions were basically telling them that the world was created so that kings could rule and they could obey. That's what they saw. And then when they turned around and said, no, actually, water is the first principle of things, or actually the world consists of atoms bouncing around in a void. What they were really saying is the world is something that we can explain rationally, and I'm not going to take your mythological stories. I'm not going to take your Genesis biblical story and accept that as the basis for how we order things. I'm going to ask for explanations, and I'm going to ask for every command, every exercise of authority to be justified, to be explained. And so I think you can see that in that ancient world. I think you can also see, by the way, to connect it with my inequality stuff, that at the time that the pre-Socratics were coming out, Greece was in fact equalizing quite a bit. You were seeing quite a flourishing of the culture. It was precisely because some of the old hierarchies had fallen away. So I think you can see these things happening in many other places. I won't go into it, but I think Taoism in China actually reflects a kind of similar development that's happening there.
Agree.
And by the way, it's roughly the same time period that I'm talking about. So I do think that what we're talking about here are things that happen throughout history. I think that we need to tell ourselves better stories, because what I also want people to do is become a little more philosophical, because I'm convinced that if they're willing to ask for explanations, we'll have a more reasonably ordered world.
So before you end, so I am scrolling down. So my personal study like 20 years ago, but was like comparing St. Augustine and the City of God with like Livy. And I was really interested to ask you about and I'm totally going to butcher Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity.
Feuerbach, yeah.
Yeah. Has anybody kind of compared that to the City of God, or is that this is just a personal question? I'm sorry for all of our book listeners, but
Well, I mean, Augustine stands at, near the beginning of, like Nicene Christianity, right? Where,
yeah, and they
Christianity
all had to
as it
agree
came
on
to dominate.
something, and then the power structure, right?
And, and Feuerbach, um, represents according to himself, an attempt to sort of overcome or move beyond that. And so, one part of his narrative would fit very easily within what we today call like the secularization narrative. He's basically saying, look, there was an age of theology, and then and that's where people like Augustine kind of dominated, and they essentially told us what God wants us to do, and that has been replaced by an age of anthropology, and or philosophy, right? Which is where instead of looking for answers from religious creeds, we see all of those creeds as expressions of something about humanity, right? So the Feuerbachian doctrine is that all of religion is essentially a human product, and it's not that it's unimportant, it's quite important, but you need to understand, if you're really going to understand it, you need to understand what it's doing for humans, and in what ways it represents or doesn't represent humanity.
And I think my reading of City of God, not how it was used later and interpreted, is that at that moment in time, it was responding, it was kind of doing that. But to your point of how things get twisted and controlled and become something else.
But one thing on Augustine, I think that you might be talking about his Confessions too, because that's a much more personal work. Um, and there's actually, I would say, more of a connection, because the Confessions are, they're quite intensely personal, and he's explaining his faith in terms of his own evolution, and what it kind of how it changed him personally. And that interestingly it would provide a kind of closer link to Feuerbach, I would say.
Well, I think that if I really want to keep talking about this, I'm going to have to write my own book, taking Plato's Republic to City of God, stopping in Rome on the way. But since I haven't done that, I'm going to go back to ask you.
But we
My
need you to run the bookstore too, okay? So.
That's right. I believe in my labor, believe me. But I let's okay, my next question does go back to this, but as you study this movement of brighter ideas and their effect on the collective narrative, as you just said, we need to tell ourselves better stories. Actually, I'm just gonna jump away from that because we kind of addressed it. I thought I was very moved and intrigued, and kind of remembered when Frederick Douglass's understanding about the psychological and political power of photography. And then in that same way, how you highlight over and over and over, he uses this cloak and dagger. I mean, all of the characters use this cloak and dagger way of getting ideas in front of people. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how Frederick Douglass uses photography to talk about and it's okay if we want to go somewhere else, but the viewer and the viewed in mutual regard. If you lay it out in the book, but it's something I would love to hear you expand upon a little bit.
Yeah, so just so your readers know, there's There's a great book on Frederick Douglass and photography. It's published 8 or 9 years ago, um, and it explains how he was in fact one of the most photographed, or perhaps the most photographed individual in the middle of the 19th century. And there's, just a whole series of stunning photographs of him. And it explains, it lays out the detail of how this really mattered to him, how he thought it was important. Um, and I think to understand it fully, the philosophy does help. So here's the key thing that he was getting from Feuerbach and from the German philosophers. It was that human beings can really only achieve their identity, can only become what they are when they see themselves through other people's eyes. So the Germans, the philosophers, moved away from the idea that you might associate with, a philosopher like Descartes, that the I, the ego, sort of springs up out of nothing through its own self-reflection, and it's like, oh, I'm me, I'm the big I, and I can sit on the moon and I'll just be an I, right? Because I get to think for myself. I think that the German philosophers, people like Fichte and Hegel, had this insight. It's been around before; they didn't invent it, but they really made a meal out of it, in which they understood that, in fact, when I talk about who I am, when you talk about who you are, we're necessarily talking about ourselves as other people might see us. We need to see ourselves in that kind of regard. We find purpose by basically coming up with a purpose that other people can understand. And we inhabit that space, that sort of intersubjective space of purpose of understanding. Now, what does the photograph do? You have to remember that up until 1839 with the daguerreotype, the only likenesses people had were painted portraits that don't really look like, they're just hugely subjective. The photograph does this thing, and we're talking here mainly about photographs of faces. In fact, pretty much that's what Douglas was interested in, photographs of faces or people, and those faces and those people kind of create that moment of recognition where we see ourselves in them, we see ourselves through them. And so what he said is, what this does is it takes the lowest washerwoman, he says, the enslaved person. You take the photograph and you can see that it's a human being. You look in their eyes and you see it's a human that's looking back at you. And conversely, you take a mighty, prince or princess, and you can see that, yeah, they've got some nice clothes, but they're also just a person. They've got issues too, and they're looking back at you. So he saw, photography as this great equalizer. It was also very important for him to, because he thought it was a way in which he could refigure the perceptions of race. So, he as you can imagine, 19th century sort of drawn and painted depictions of Black Americans are just caricatures, and they're kind of pretty appalling, always showing sort of crazy features and, making people look less than human. And he thought the photograph, and especially the photograph of himself, was a way to change what people thought about the race. And about color. So it was very important for him, and for me, in my own little nerdy way, the photography stuff was really cool, because when he does these lectures on photography, he is just spouting German philosophy left and right. I mean, the whole thing is written like, Ludwig Feuerbach came back from the dead and just, or was sort of ventriloquizing through Frederick Douglass. So it's quite interesting. And if I may add one other thing, that his stuff on photography, he gave these lectures on photography. He gave them in Boston in the 1860s after the war broke out. And it's really a funny thing, because he gives these lectures and he starts off by saying, well, so there's this war going on, and you might think it's odd that I'm talking about photography in the middle of a war. And he says, well, maybe it is a little odd, but by the end, it's pretty clear that it's not odd, that in fact, in talking about photography and in talking about the importance of this mutual recognition, he's getting at one of the core things that are at stake in the war. And he says that, if you ask why we're at war, it's because we violated the fundamental chemistry of the universe, because we violated this thing that we can all see, this equality that we all have. We violated that in our system, and that's why we're at war. So it's a very interesting and quite moving context. And it was also, by the way, a series of lectures that were given in honor of Theodore Parker, who was one of the other characters in my book, who at that point was dead. So it's a very interesting subject, and I do recommend people go look at the photography book. It's quite, and I think there have been some exhibits too, some museums.
It really captured my thinking as I am trying to understand the philosophy you highlight, and then to kind of take it to today in terms of how people see each other through social media and recognize the self. This is like an unfinished strand of thinking, but it's what I'm curious about after reading your books. And I'm not.
I mean, because that opens up a whole new thing. I mean, so you have to remember that the photography was completely new, and this idea of reproducing images. So I think now with our technological situation, we have such a surplus of images that I think you kind of almost run into the opposite thing, where we use images to hide rather than to show, right? Where we're kind of putting up masks all the time, and we've basically figured out the technology well enough to sort of create the kind of sort of fake world. So I don't want to use Frederick Douglass to end up with
no, and I agree, but
here.
it also made me kind of want to re-pick apart and look at things, which is the whole point of lots of reading. So it is 4:46. So those who have joined us live, if you are interested in asking a question, please type it in the chat. Otherwise, I am going to keep asking my many questions that I still have. Or is there anything that you hope for these books, kind of as the Emancipation of the Mind came out yesterday? It was reviewed in the New York Times. With a really solid overview of it. What are your thoughts about as this book kind of disseminates across people?
I actually haven't seen that review that you refer to. I guess there are several themes that we've already touched on them, but I think they're important for people to know. One is that I'd like Americans to think about their history in a more international context. So I think a lot of our American stories are kind of incredibly American centered, and we really should understand that the American Revolution, for example, was drawing on ideas from all over the world and on people from all over the world. And in this book, I think it's very important to get across this message that the war over slavery, yes, it happened in America, and yes, the United States was in some ways one of the leading slave powers, but it wasn't the only one. But what happened here was hugely influenced by what was going on elsewhere in the world. So it was hugely influenced, obviously, through the economic relations, but in addition to that, it was the ideas were flowing back and forth, and then people. So these German immigrants who came over, they were they played a big role. So that's one set of themes that I'd like people to take away is, that the American story is really a part of a global story. Um, and also that, by the way, that what was happening in America in turn had a really big impact on what was happening elsewhere. So the revolutions of 1848 in Europe were to a significant degree influenced by what had happened previously in 1776 in America and also in Haiti. Um, I guess another theme that I think is really important is the philosophy one. That many of America's early leaders they're quite remarkable. In a world historical context, they're really they like to read. They were pretty smart, and they uh, made use of a lot of this philosophy, and that's a part of our history that I think is, it was sort of there when I was growing up a little bit, like, oh yeah, the founders, were part of the Enlightenment vaguely, but I want people to take that more seriously, and I think that hasn't been taken seriously enough, especially in the Civil War context. So that's another theme, but then I think more generally, like I'm kind of an optimist, on America, which I know is probably um, harder to maintain these days. But you know, we tell ourselves too many. Especially, I'm thinking now of people more on the progressive side. Yes, it's important to understand these huge injustices in America's past, but we can tell a story that recognizes those injustices, but doesn't basically, condemn us to a cycle of perpetual doom and repetition of the injustice. There are actually moments where things do move forward, and we need to grab hold of those and understand them, understand why they happened, because they did. And so I want that to come out, and that's also part of why I want this idea of a counter revolution to get a little more weight than it has in the past, because I think we need to be able to distinguish those parts of American history that have advanced, those fundamental ideals that we have, and we need to be able to distinguish those from, the many efforts and movements that have tried to drag things backwards. Right? And that happened. And it's happened before. It wasn't. The 19th century was a pretty ugly place in many respects, and things got very much worse before they got marginally better. So those, I guess, are the general ideas.
Well, I thank you. It's a really incredible argument that I think will hopefully be in academia for a long time. But I have absorbed it as a real invitation to zoom out in a big way, and with the counter revolutions, and then kind of with every understanding, and you highlight this, of course, we reinterpret it to serve whoever is in charge, and then, re-examining our narratives and taking it as an invitation to do that. And to bring, how did you end it? Since we're about to end our chat, this is the last chance for those attending live to ask a question. But
Yeah, I hope people have questions. I mean, or don't be shy. How did I end this book?
oh, it's pretty clear.
So yeah, I mean, the revolutionary project of self-government through reason is not a permanent fact, but an ongoing struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. So we have to look at our founding, which has a lot to commend it and a lot to be criticized. We have to look at it not as something that absolutely defined us, but as perhaps in the best case, an example, right? As representing certain ideals, but not realizing them for all time. I mean, the idea that it sort of all got set in stone, and we should like stop our clocks at 1787, like some of these nutcases on the new right seem to think. That's crazy. You don't achieve anything by sort of locking things in some sort of freezer and keeping things according, according to the original meaning of the Constitution or something like that.
Well, that's what I
Uh,
love about your larger argument and bringing philosophy to the conversation, is because it allows you, taking it into a philosophical context, allows the conversation to go so far back into history that you can understand the pendulum swing that gets from Taoism to the Magna Carta, to Cartism, to your labor. Like, you can just see that. And, you call out so many other in your afterword, which is really powerful. It's an invitation not only to everyone watching who's going to buy this book from the Country Bookshop, but to other modern thinkers to really re-examine how they're interpreting everything, to reimagine how they're interpreting everything for us. So thank you.
oh, thank you. It's been great to talk, and I hope the bookshop business goes well. I think we should remember how important they've been in our history.
That's right. And you can buy all these books. I will link to them for everyone. And Matthew, thank you. If you get to North Carolina, you come visit us, please.
Yeah, well, Southern Pines is now on my menu, so.
Excellent. I look forward to it. Well, thank you all for joining. And for those of you who could not join live, we look forward to, we hope you enjoy it. So thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.